Hey everybody, let's dig in and explore the WordPress graph. So who am I? I'm Colby Fayock. I'm the one hugging BB and Kylo Ren over there. I work with the dev community as a developer experience engineer over at Cloudinary. You can pretty much find me anywhere on the web by just Googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. So let's start off by addressing the CMS in the room. It's 2021 and some developers would still cringe at the thought of using WordPress, but frankly, we're still living in a WordPress world. According to Build with Trends a little bit ago, if we look at the CMS distribution of the top 1 million sites, 37% of websites are using WordPress. That's a huge percentage. And I'm sure it's going to have gone up by now, and I'm not quite sure how accurate it is, but if you look at the number of detections on the built list site, it's over 960 million installs of WordPress. That's almost 1 billion. That's a staggering number. While we might not all want to use WordPress, it's realistically around to stay for the foreseeable future. But hold up, why am I even talking about WordPress? Well, jumping back a bit, WordPress as we traditionally know it is an all-in-one CMS and website solution. It works server-side to grab all the data from the database, render it to HTML, and then send it over to the browser. But since 4.7, WordPress now supports a REST API. This means right out of the box, we actually can use WordPress headlessly. If you haven't heard of the term headless before, what does that actually mean? Well, with our traditional stack like WordPress, somebody will visit a page in the browser. The browser reaches out to the server will do the work like make those requests to the database, render the HTML for the page, and then send that response. If we're lucky, it'll return it cached. Finally, the browser will display that response to the person who's visiting that site. With a headless approach, that request to the server might be asynchronous on the client. In this particular example, the person would visit a page in their browser and immediately get a response straight from storage. Once that page loads inside of the browser will kick off another request to a server which can load all that dynamic content. But I would imagine you're probably wondering, why would we want to make a client-side request to WordPress for a CMS? And that's not necessarily the recommended approach. That's where static site generators and modern web frameworks come in. They do all the hard lifting before the page actually hits the browser. We can use front-end frameworks to get all that data at compile time or with server-side rendering, avoiding that cost inside of the browser. Now, if this all sounds new to you, it might sound like a lot of work. Why even bother with an API? Why not use WordPress out of the box like we always do? So let's focus on this example of using an API with a static site, where the only time we reach out to that API is at compile time, and we store the HTML files directly in storage. We get a lot of benefits from actually avoiding hitting the server directly on each of those requests. With most of our base solutions, server-based solutions like WordPress, there's a lot of options to help speed things up. For WordPress specifically, that includes some plugins to cache or some custom work under the hood, but each page is still a server hit, which is still prone to its ups and downs. On the other hand, with our statically compiled site, a static HTML file is just going to be fast. Instead of spending time rendering on a server, you serve a static file straight from storage or a CDN. While you can do this by default with WordPress, it's often much more complicated. And some of the plugins that cache might serve an HTML file, but they still serve it from a regular server, not static storage. With any server, we're typically paying for how much we actually expect our traffic to be. While most of the time that is predictable, we all hope to one day have a viral post. And if that happens, the people visiting our site will be the ones paying for it with slow speeds or timeouts. There are solutions like load balancing and auto scaling, but those aren't perfect solutions, and we might not always be able to handle that surge in traffic. Back to the fact that we're serving static HTML files because we're serving files straight from storage, or better yet, statically from the CDN, buzzword alert, that means our user-facing website is going to infinitely scale. That static site will survive the Reddit hug of death when your post goes viral. But managing servers isn't always cheap. While a low traffic personal blog could maybe manage to be a few dollars a month, the more that traffic grows, the more that cost is going to grow. While you do still have those options like load balancing and auto scaling, those services add up really quickly. And without it, you again risk your site slowing down or worse, downtime. But storage is cheap. It's really cheap. We can maintain huge static projects on AWS using S3 for a really low cost. But even if we still manage a server, the usage is going to be much, much lower because we're only having to deal with content managers or requests at compile time. Now, I hopefully convinced you as to why headless is a good thing, or at least set up some context about what's actually coming next. So how would I apply this to WordPress? Well, back to the REST API, if I want to start building out my new static blog, I'll ultimately need to fetch all of my data. I'll start off by going to WPJSON, which is going to be some basic info about my website, along with a list of routes showing what endpoints are actually available to hit. Next, I want to add my blog posts, so I can hit the post endpoint and easily get them all. I can then simply load them up inside my application and iterate through all of them inside of the UI. But I want to add more details to this. I want to know, for instance, who the author is. So I find the author ID in the post, and it probably doesn't make sense to hit every individual author one by one, because that could be a lot of authors. So I hit the author's endpoint and I try to match up the data. But now I also want to show some categories in that page. So again, I find the IDs, but this time for the categories, and I request all categories, and again, match up the data. Looking back at what I just did though, I just made 4 separate requests to get the data that I needed for the page. Luckily, in my example, I'm statically compiling, so that might not necessarily end up costing the user, but that will certainly make development a bit slower. On top of that, added complexity of managing all of that data and filtering it down so that I don't actually pass all of that data as giant arrays as props into the actual page, along with generally the extra strain on the WordPress instance for all those requests. Now, this isn't meant to shame the WordPress API, nor is it meant to say that REST is inherently bad, but we're dealing with complex relationships in our data. We don't want to be limited by individual endpoints, leaving us with long chains of requests and more data than we actually need. We want to be able to provide the best experience we can. Now, this is GraphQL Galaxy, so I think you probably know where I'm getting at here, but we can seriously level up the way that we're interfacing with our WordPress data by using GraphQL. And to do that, thanks to Jason Ball, who created the wonderful WP GraphQL, along with all the other hardworking contributors, we can add the power of GraphQL to WordPress. We can do this by simply installing it as a plugin right inside of our dashboard, giving us the ability to query our WordPress data with GraphQL. So before, I was talking about how I didn't like the idea of having to make all these 4 requests all chained together. So instead, we can load up our GraphQL client like Apollo, and we can make a single request with our query. Instead of having to manage 4 full dumps of data where we need to match everything up and have complicated logic and actually avoid bloating the application, I can query for only the data that I need, with all my relationships already intact, meaning there's less data that I have to manage and far less complexity. Now again, I'm going to do this during compile time, but we can see the realistic impact of what those requests would look like by making the request inside of the browser. While those KBs and milliseconds might not seem like a lot, it really does add up and it becomes more noticeable inside the rendering experience. Not to mention, I don't have a lot of posts on the endpoints that I'm actually hitting here, so imagine a huge site that has a ton of posts. Also, that was on my fast files connection. It's a little bit different when we see what that looks like when throttling with something like fast 3G connection. The post endpoint with my small amount of posts still took 3 seconds, so it really starts to become a huge difference. Now, ultimately, we want to pull this into our application. We want to build that beautiful WordPress blog. So this is where Next.js comes in. Like I mentioned earlier, WP GraphQL is a WordPress plugin install away. Once that's installed, you immediately have access to all of your data. The cool thing is with GraphQL, the graphical explorer is that it's installed by default with WP GraphQL, and it lets you interactively explore all of your data. You're able to click through and see everything that you're actually able to query right inside of that dashboard. And as you're doing that, in the middle column, it's actually building the exact query that you need for your app. And I've done just that with creating what I call the Next.js WordPress starter, which lets anybody spin up a WordPress site with Next.js super easily. Like you typically expect from a WordPress blog, the homepage is full of the most recent posts. I take advantage of get static props, where I request all those posts at compile time. That gets injected into the page, and I can build out my page exactly how I want with all of the pagination. Now, of course, I want to make sure that we have all of the routes for our posts. So we can take advantage of get static paths, which is how we can tell Next.js exactly what paths or pages that we want to make sure gets built. And once we define those paths, we can then look up the data, again using get static props with each of those parameters. I would imagine someone would typically expect search as well, and the WordPress API provides search capabilities, but like I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to statically compile this, so then we would still be hitting the server, which I don't want to do here. So I took advantage of Next.js sitting on top of Webpack, and I created a Webpack compiler that fetched all the posts at compile time. It would then create a search index, a static one, with titles and paths right inside of that static file. It then loads that into memory, or it loads it asynchronously on the client, and we can make sure our search is right to that index. The nice thing is we can couple this with all of our WordPress plugins that we are used to, like Yoast and ACF, where this gives us a lot of flexibility for how we actually manage our content and data. And these all work perfectly with WPGraphQL. So you're still querying all those data relationships with that one endpoint, with everything right intact. So I know you all don't want to just see some screenshots of some code, so let's do a really quick walkthrough. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to first jump into an existing WordPress instance. I'm going to show you how we can simply install WPGraphQL. We'll then open up the Graphical Explorer so we can just kind of poke around and query our data a little bit. And then finally, we're going to create a new application using an example starter that I created, where we can see some existing requests and maybe tweak those requests just to see how we can pull in new data. So let's dive in. All right, so we're going to get started with pretty much a fresh new WordPress instance I have from WP Engine, where I have a little bit of preloaded content in here, including some posts and some pages, just so that we have something to actually query here. But really the point is that I'm trying to make is that there's really nothing special going on in here yet. And we can even see under the plugins that we don't have any plugins installed. But our goal is to ultimately actually query all this post data with GraphQL. So what we want to do is we want to install that WP GraphQL plugin to actually be able to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click Add New under Plugins, and I'm going to go to Search, and I'm going to search for WP GraphQL, which we can see that I've done before. And as soon as I make that search, we can see that right now in the first slot is that WP GraphQL plugin that I'm going to install. And then as soon as it's done, I'm going to activate it. And we can see as soon as it's activated over in the left sidebar here, I now have this GraphQL tab, and I can even click this graphical IDE page where it's going to load up, and we can see that we have this graphical editor. Now, as I talked about earlier in my talk, we have the ability to actually real time go through all of our data using this query editor. That way we can both see all the data that we have available, but we can build our query so that we can later use it inside of our application. Now, to see how this works, let's try to check out what our posts look like. So if I scroll down inside of this Explorer panel, we can see that I have my post right here, where if I start to open that up, we can then see in the middle column that it's starting to build that query in real time. Now let's add some data to that, where if I start opening up the edges and the node for those edges, we can now see all the attributes that I actually have for each of those posts, where let's grab some things that make sense, like the date, and we have our ID for each of the posts. And how about our title for the post, where now if we click play, we can see that in this far right column, I now have all that data for each of my posts. We can see exactly what we showed over in this post page, but we now are able to query that with our WP GraphQL via GraphQL plugin. So now let's actually try to see how we can take this data and use it to build an application. So what we're going to do that is, because the Next.js WordPress starter that I actually created is probably a little bit too complex for trying to walk through in this demo, I have this simpler example starter where really it's just a basic demo of adding some posts to the page. That way we can see what it looks like to actually query the data in real time, and we can even tweak that query so that we can see what it's like to actually build the query, modify the query, and actually update it. So if we scroll down on this page, we can see the instructions for how we can get started with this, which is actually going to be similar to the Next.js WordPress starter, where we're going to copy this yarn create command, where we're going to use create next app in order to do so. So if I head to my terminal and I actually paste in that query, and let's call this application my GraphQL Galaxy. And what this is going to do, if you're not familiar with create next app, is it's going to first basically clone down this example project that I have here. It's going to then install all the dependencies, and it's even going to reset the Git history. Basically, it's going to get us immediately ready to get started and get productive with our application. So now we can see that it's done. I'm going to go ahead and cd into that directory, and we can see that we actually have one more step before we try to spin up this page, where we need to add an environment variable, and this is going to be our GraphQL endpoint for our WordPress instance. So as we can see, Next.js convention, we're going to add this .env.local file. So I'm going to first open up my code editor with my new project. And at the root of the files, at the root of the project, I'm going to create a new file called .env.local. And inside here, I'm going to add that environment variable. Now over back on the instructions, I'm going to copy and paste that right inside. And next, we don't want to try to query your host.com, we want to actually query our WordPress GraphQL endpoint. And that endpoint is going to, by default, be basically wherever your WordPress instance is installed /GraphQL. So for instance, if I open up my spacejellydemo.wpengine.com/GraphQL, we can see that while I do get an error here, we are able to see that this is a working GraphQL endpoint. So I'm going to take the same URL and I'm going to paste it right into my environment variable, where we can see we now have this WordPress GraphQL endpoint set to my actual URL. And now let's try to spin up our development server by running yarn dev. And we can see that immediately it's going to spin up a new server pointed at localhost port 3000. And if I actually try to open that up inside my browser, we can see that Next.js is going to start to compile that page, where basically it's pulling down that information for us and it's going to actually build that page in real time. So we can see here now that I have my new blog post, my blog page, that is my blog website. And we can see that if we start to scroll down here, we have all those posts that we saw right inside of WordPress, but now we're actually getting them inside the application inside of our browser. So now we can see that we have each of the title and we have the description and we even have a link for each of our posts, but we want to add a little bit more context to this. How about, what if we want to add the author to each of these posts? First, let's dive into the code to see how this is actually happening. So I'm going to go back to my code editor and I'm going to particularly go to source pages index.js, which is going to be our homepage. And if we see at the top here, if you're already familiar with React, there's really nothing special going on here. Really, we have our home component that's taking two props and it's rendering that out into the page. But what is special is if we scroll way past that React component, we have this function that we're exporting called getStaticProps, which is the Next.js way to fetch data that's going to be static for our application at compile time, where we can see that we're getting our Apollo client and we're building this GraphQL query where we're grabbing some general settings for our website, but we're also grabbing all those posts just like we saw that we did before inside the graphical editor. Finally, once we have that data, we're going to just clean it up a little bit, and we're also going to construct the path that each of the posts is going to be available at, and then we're going to simply pass them as props, which again, if we scroll back to the top of the page, we can see that page and post props that we're passing right to the React component. And then at that point, it's just like any other React component, where we're grabbing those posts, we're iterating through, and we're able to render each one of those inside of the DOM, where then we have our Space Jelly demo blog site. So now, like I said, we want to add that author to it. So I'm going to first grab that existing GraphQL query that we saw right here, the one that we're actively using inside this project, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it right in to my graphical editor here. I'm going to click Prettify here just to fix the indenting, but I'm going to click play, and we can see this is exactly the data that we're getting and passing into the application. We see that we have all the posts, we even get the excerpt here, but we also get that title and description, which we can see at the top that we're showing. So now we have all this other information for our post. We want to also add the author to it. So we're going to find that post section, which is right here. We have our posts, and for each of those edges in the node, we also want to add the author. So I'm going to simply start to open up that author, query the node for each of those authors. Then we can see we get all the attributes for the actual author on the post. Or in this instance, we probably want to grab the ID, since that's something that we usually want to have for each of our nodes. But then we want to also grab the name, which if we click play now, and I start to scroll down on the received data, we can see that we now see the author for each of these posts, which in this particular instance, it's myself. We see Colby Fayock here, but we see how we were able to see how easy it was to paste in our existing query, update it, where now just as easily as we pasted it in, let's copy this and let's paste it right back into our application. We're now going to fix that indentation there. We just updated the query inside of our app. And to see that this is actually working, I'm going to console log out the actual posts prop here, where if we go inside our browser, I'm going to refresh the page, and I misspelled that there. So instead of console logs, there's only one of them. But we can see when the page actually reloads and recompiles, we have this array of data, which is all of our posts, but we now have this author property here where if I start to expand everything, we can then see my name, Colby Fayock. So let's actually add this into our page. So I'm going to head down inside this React component where, how about right under the title, let's add a new paragraph tag and let's say bye, and we're going to add our username. Let me close this paragraph tag, but we're going to specify the post.author.node.name. And just for my sanity purpose, the node author node name. So let's see if that works. So now if we reload the page, and it actually probably should have fast reloaded, we can see that I do have by Colby Fayock there. And of course, the spacing probably isn't the best. We can fix the styling later, but we could see how easy it was to update our query, simply add a little bit of data to that by updating that GraphQL query, and we were able to immediately have that available on that post prop that we just passed right into the application. And we were able to do that because we now have the power to query those complex relationships, even the categories if we want, by using GraphQL and WordPress. All right, so let's actually recap what we achieved here. We first took an existing WordPress instance and we installed WPGraphQL. Once that was ready, we were able to see how easily we can query all that WordPress data with GraphQL. Finally, we bootstrapped a new application that takes advantage of querying with GraphQL. And then we added some extra info on top of the UI. Now, the goal here wasn't to get everybody, all of you, over to jump ship to WordPress, but it's to show the flexibility of it and why it's still a compelling option for a data management solution when coupled with GraphQL. We can come up with some pretty powerful solutions that provide a great experience for both our users and our developers. If you want to check out my work, Next.js WordPress Starter is completely open source on my GitHub. And if you want to learn how to actually do all this in practice, you can check out my course, E-commerce on the Jamstack, over on Level Up Tutorials. And that's it. If you want to learn more or chat about the talk, you can find me everywhere at Colby Fayock. I'll also tweet out some of the stuff you've seen here today. Thanks, everybody.